Hello YouTube, this is my second video I made within 24 hours after my exams. I have been locked into my room working and my family and friends have not seen me for multiple days. If any of you guys can please call them for me, they are very worried. But now that I'm locked in here anyway, I'd better do something useful with my time and defuse an age-old question in the Elder Scrolls lore. What are the lifespans of the races? So without further ado, let's do exactly that. Now, the lifespans of the races have been a discussion point for many years, practically since the first Elder Scrolls arena. There has never been much lore on the subject at all, and what we have is mostly guesswork and offhand developer remarks. Now, in my video on sex and relationships in the Elder Scrolls universe, I made a remark that the elf races live around 200 to 300 years, and boy oh boy, I got in trouble for that. A lot of triggered commenters gave me a lecture on how high elves are supposed to live 1,000 years, and yeah, I'm not buying that. But I'm not buying my earlier remark about 200 or 300 years either, now that I've looked into it a little bit more. You see, let's for convenience just start with the lifespans of high elves. Previously, it was always believed that high elves could live naturally up to 2,000 years. Mostly from offhand dialogue remarks we concluded that, and specific NPCs that lived so long. Or just general pop culture, as in modern fantasy stories, high elves usually live exceptionally long, usually even longer than thousands of years, or even immortality. Now, this assumption was debunked by a Q&A with the developers of the Elder Scrolls Online, when somebody asked them to explain the lifespans of the races in that Q&A. In that Q&A, the developer literally said, elves live 2 to 3 times as long as humans and the beast races, Orcs, Khajiit and Argonians. A 200-year-old elf is old, a 300-year-old elf is very old, and very old indeed. Anyone older than that has prolonged his or her lifespan through powerful magic. However, this does not solve the mystery at all. This remark by this developer makes it harder. The developer comment has in the lore community been highly controversial, as it completely generalizes all the elf and also a bit of the beast races, plus it completely dismisses some very crucial points in the lore from previous games. This is, as the lore community calls it, a lore inconsistency. But I would like to disagree. It's the only official remark that we have about the lifespans of the races, so we should do something with it, even if it heavily generalizes the races. So what I personally think is that this developer comment is an average between the elf races. Some might live longer, some might live shorter. I don't know if the developer intended this as an average, and it probably not, since it was just a quick remark. But taking this as an average is the only way we can fit this comment into the established lore. In a way, if we take the full picture from all games and this comment, it will make sense. Because otherwise it would completely contradict the games. But if we take it as an average, it might just work. So, what do I think the lifespans of the high elves is? Well, I think that a good average for high elves would be 350 years old for your average veteran Altmer. And I think that 500 years old would be the average among the real old Altmer, of which there are probably still many left, as well. In general, high elves have the healthiest society with the least diseases and internal violence in Tamriel, so it would make sense for the most high elves per capita to reach the maximum age of their race in a natural way. This would perfectly fit the average and fit into established lore. As an Oblivion pocket guide to the Empire book, it proclaims that very many old Altmer from the time of Tiber Septim's conquest are still alive in the Somerset Isles and still have grudges. Of course, there are high elves that we know that have lived over 1,000 years and even beyond that. And it's very possible that high elves are very good with magic, that since they are very good with magic, they were able to prolong their lives. While I think that an old Altmer living a natural life can become 500 years old, a high elf with magic, or at least that's really skilled with magic, would easily be able to live over 1,000 years. Some NPCs in Morrowind even mention rumors that Altmer exist within the Somerset Isles that have lived more than 4,000 years. I can imagine this kind of thing also being tied to your social status in the Somerset Isles. Ultimate nobility would, well, have mages prolonging their life for them, or even do it themselves if they're skilled enough with magic. And the very strong mages would also prolong their own, and in that way they would gain a social status. But the peasants of the Somerset Isles that would have to go without this kind of magic would live, I think, about 400 to 500 years old. Now, onto the low end of the Elvish average. The Bosmer. We don't have many sources on them, but considering that of the elf races they are the least developed in terms of magic. They are a developed race, but they're not in terms of magic, they're not particularly skilled. And we have no actual examples of Bosmer living beyond 200 years old. I would suspect Bosmer living, well, 150 to 200, maybe 250 years old if you stretch it. Now, I could be wrong in this assumption, and I probably am, but considering the things that we know about the Bosmer, it leads me to believe that, well, 150 to 200 years isn't too crazy of an assumption for your average Bosmer. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. Now, onto the Orsimer, the Orcs. They are technically a mer race, although a lot of people seem conflicted on that, even though the lore clearly states it. But I'm not going to go into that discussion. Let's for this video just assume that they're mer. A lot of people on the internet that I have seen, and I have seen the majority of the lifespan threads by now, because this video had a good 20-hour research for it, seems to assume that orcs just don't live much beyond their 80 years, making them practically the shortest lived race among the mer. While that is a possibility that they only live about 80 years, I tend to disagree. You see, orc philosophy states that orcs become useless and old after the age of 60 to 80, somewhere between those ages. Most orcs then see if they can find a death in honor before their power crumbles away. This makes it so that most orcs will only live 80 years on the max. However, this is not their actual lifespan. Their actual lifespans can potentially be very much longer. A good example of this is the librarian from the College of Winterhold, Urek, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his full name. He has several hundred years behind him without being particularly skilled in magic, since he's just a librarian. Now, as I said, it's possible that he is strong enough with magic, I just don't think so, or that the mages keep him alive at the college to tend to the books. However, there's no real evidence for that in the game, so I'm going to keep orc lifespan in the middle. My personal conviction is that they are several hundred years, probably. However, I recognize the possibility that their natural lifespans might be much shorter. Well, I want to know, what do you guys think? What is the actual lifespan of the orcs? So, finally there's the Dunmer. The Dunmer are infamous for their Telvanni wizards, who live thousands of years. But there's the keyword, wizards. The Telvanni live exceptionally long because they extend their lives using magic. I personally suspect that a regular Dunmer peasant would not live that long as a Telvanni wizard, of course. I think that it would still live very long. I think longer than the Bosmer, but not as long as the High Elves. So I suspect the Dunmer to have lifespans around the average that we called earlier from the developer remark. So say 250 to 350 years. Still a long time, and we know that some Dunmer lived longer, even though they weren't exceptional mages like Queen Berenzia, but you can argue that they are nobility and perhaps their lives have been prolonged by court wizards. But I think that the average, so 250 to 350 years, is a good assumption for your regular everyday Dunmer. Now, for the human races, Nords, Imperials and Redguards. For them the answer is pretty straightforward. They live about as long as we do, maybe a bit longer, maybe a bit shorter. Their life patterns and their aging in the games and the novels seems to match that of ours, so I think that on an average, a healthy human can become, say, 80 years old, with 110 being about the maximum. We don't have much instances of humans extending their lives beyond this through magic, however I imagine that it must be possible. And then there's the Bretons. Bretons have been very misread in most threads that I viewed online. A lot of people seem to think that the Bretons should live a bit longer than your average human. Makes sense, since they're half elvish. They would live longer, right? Logic says yes, and I would have agreed with you, but after some more research, the lore actually says no. Bretons live shorter than humans. You see, apparently the fact that Bretons are part Mer seems to work as a drawback on their lifespans. We can read this in the brief history of the Empire books. There's a remark made about a middle-aged man aging like a Breton. That sentence was literally made. And then dying at 49 years old, because apparently that was old for a Breton. This remark leads me to believe that while the mixed blood gives the Bretons more affinity with magic, it has a drawback on their lives, leading them to live only 50 to maybe 60 years old. I found this comment very peculiar, that he aged like a Breton. It's a bit of a weird... I don't know, I'd never seen it before in the lore. But it's the only canon source on the lifespan that we have. I can imagine, since they are more affinity with magic, they have some magical way to prolong their lifespans with magic. And, well, as long as they have the magical skill. But I found it interesting to learn that, well, it's a common misconception that apparently Bretons live longer than normal humans. Now, finally we have the Khajiit and Argonians. Often in online threads I have seen many assumptions reaching far and wide, but I think that the answers for their lifespans are actually pretty obvious and aren't really fixed. But then again, those are just my theories and you may disagree, that's what we're here for. Khajiit are not all one species, there are many types of Khajiit, and I went over this in my video on sex and procreation. The species of Khajiit you become is influenced not by your parents, but by the stance and the phases of the moons. So I would imagine their lifespans being variable per Khajiit race. Every race of Khajiit will probably have their own lifespans, so their own values. I mean, a small Khajiit will not live as long as a large Khajiit race. With some not living longer than perhaps house cats, as they are essentially house cats, and others like the ones we see in the games and that we can play in the games might live as long as humans, or maybe even longer, or maybe even as long as the Bosmer, as Khajiit are vaguely related to them in their genetics to the Bosmer. Exact numbers we don't have, conflicting accounts we do have, because then again the developer remark said that they live about as long as humans, and I can imagine that for some of the Khajiit races, but I simply cannot accept that every Khajiit race, whether you're a small house cat or a really large tiger, that you all have the same kind of lifespans. That makes no sense to me. And I find it actually kind of baffling that most people that I read online completely generalize every Khajiit race and just generalize their lifespans. But then again, I might be wrong in this. And finally, the Argonians. Now, there are multiple ways to approach this. A, we can just accept the developer comment and just say that they live about as long as humans, even though we have conflicting sources on that. Or we compare them to reptiles in our own world, which would say that they have longer lives than humans, if we take everything into account, like they have a humanoid body but a reptilian system. Because the reptilian systems are a bit different from ours, because they have slower metabolism and their bodies age far less fast than ours, and thus they will inevitably get older, since their body gets old slower. But I don't like this explanation, as in lore there are some contradicting facts on the Argonians. We have some living about as long as humans, and we know of some that they become over 200 years old. However, there's something you need to remember. If we take the reptilian system for Argonians, that wouldn't work, because the Argonians come from the Hist, and we know that the Hist can just change the Argonians, even the insides of Argonians, while they live. So I personally suspect, since they are created from the Hist and the Hist can even alter their physical appearance in their lives, I think the Hist also determine how old an Argonian will become. Some will be old, some will be young. I suspect that if the Hist wished to do so, they could essentially design an Argonian that could live as long as the High Elves, or maybe even longer. Now this is just my theory, and just like with the Khajiit, since we simply don't have enough sources on it, you have to take my theory for it, or make your own theory. I mean, that's what we're here for. This is basically all I have to say about the subject. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, subscribe, click the bell icon if you actually want to see my videos. If you want personal contact with me, my Discord and Instagram are in the description. Also in the description is my Patreon. On that you get all kinds of cool little Patreon things, your name at the end of every video, and you get the right to be there at my live lore lectures. Now you can view these lectures after I've done them on YouTube, because I always publish them, but you can be attending a video recording live, and it's essentially a long lecture, And soon I will start on the big history, the big history of Nirn course, which is basically a couple of lectures detailing everything from the creation to the year 200 of the 4th era. I will generally go over all of this time. So if you want to attend one of these lectures live and actually be able to ask questions and have your questions featured in the video, then, well, subscribe to my Patreon and you will be able to attend. With that said, I just keep shamelessly plugging this. And yeah, I will see you all in the next video. Bye bye.